The invoice for my childhood was due today. My father stood in the doorway, palm outstretched, demanding payment for 18 years of arrears. I grabbed my architecture portfolio, my only proof I existed beyond their ledger. But Elena lunged, nails scraping for the birth certificate in my pocket. The shelf of power tools crashed between us. Blood dripped from my forearm. Tyler's car was my last hope, until he shook his head, whispering, "They'll ruin my parents." Now I'm running with nothing but a backpack and the clothes on my back. And they're coming. The first installment was due at midnight. I had 30 minutes and a head start. If I didn't disappear before then, I'd be more than broke. I'd be owned. Leo Miller stood in the center of his bedroom, the air thick with the cloying, synthetic scent of lavender-scented candles that his stepmother, Jennifer, insisted on burning in every hallway of the Miller mansion. The floral aroma was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight against his chest, coating the back of his throat with a bitter, soapy film. In front of him, David Miller stood like a statue carved from granite, his tailored white shirt crisp and blinding under the recessed LED lights. David didn't look like a father. He looked like a debt collector. He held a thick stack of cream-colored bond paper, the edges sharp enough to draw blood. 18 years, Leo, David said, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that mirrored the steady clink, 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 clink of the brass plumb bob Leo was tapping against his palm inside his pocket. 18 years of investment, maintenance, and overhead. I have had the accounting department at the firm run the numbers. This is not a request. This is an itemized statement of arrears. Leo's fingers tightened around the brass weight. The cold metal bit into his skin, a grounding sensation against the surreal horror of the moment. He reached out and took the papers. The top sheet was a professional invoice. It listed everything. Hospital delivery fees from 23 years ago, adjusted for inflation, the cost of private kindergarten, the exact price of every steak he'd eaten at the mahogany dining table, even a line item for emotional labor and guidance. The total at the bottom was a number that looked like a phone number, a debt so vast it effectively turned his entire existence into a predatory loan. "You're charging me for being your son?" Leo's voice was thin, echoing off the minimalist walls. "I am charging you for the resources you consumed while failing to provide a return on investment," David corrected, checking his gold watch with a flick of his wrist. "You refused the apprenticeship at the firm. You chose your own path. Fine. But in this house, we do not subsidize competitors. You have 24 hours to produce the first installment, or I will begin the process of asset recovery." Leo looked around his room. He saw his drafting table, his charcoal sketches of structural supports, and his laptop. The only tools he had to build a future that didn't involve his father's shadow. The realization hit him with the force of a falling beam. He wasn't a family member. He was a tenant in default. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply turned to his closet and pulled out a weathered canvas duffel bag. The sound of the zipper, a harsh metallic rasp, seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He began throwing clothes into the bag, his movements frantic but precise. He needed to get out before the asset recovery began, before the very bed he slept on was repossessed by the man who had bought it. "Not going somewhere?" David asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm leaving," Leo panted, stuffing his laptop into the center of the bag, wrapped in a thick wool sweater for protection. "You want your money? Sue me. But you don't own me anymore." Leo swung the bag over his shoulder and bolted for the door. He didn't take the stairs. He headed straight for the back service corridor that led to the garage. The air in the hallway was even thicker with that suffocating lavender, making his eyes water as he ran. He could hear David's leather shoes clicking on the hardwood behind him, a steady, predatory pace that never seemed to break into a run because David knew he didn't have to. Leo burst through the heavy door into the garage. The space was cavernous, smelling of expensive motor oil and the cold, sterile scent of waxed concrete. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air of the garage stinging his lungs. He reached for the handle of the side door, but a hand clamped onto his shoulder with the force of a vice. David swung him around. The bag slipped from Leo's shoulder, hitting the floor with a heavy thud that suggested something inside, perhaps his drafting kit, had shattered. "You aren't taking anything from this house, Leo," David hissed. "That laptop was purchased with Miller funds. That bag was a gift for your graduation. Everything you carry is collateral." "Let go of me," Leo shouted, his voice echoing off the hoods of the luxury cars. He shoved his father back, a desperate, uncoordinated movement. David didn't stumble. He leaned into the momentum and shoved Leo back with a practiced, brutal efficiency. Leo flew backward, his heels catching on the lip of a concrete step. He crashed into a heavy metal shelving unit filled with power tools. The impact was a symphony of violence. The shriek of sliding metal, the heavy thump of a circular saw hitting the floor inches from his head, and the sharp, stinging spray of a shattered bottle of industrial degreaser. Leo groaned, the smell of citrus and chemicals filling his nose. His elbow throbbed where it had struck the iron frame, and he could feel a warm trickle of blood beginning to itch behind his ear. David stood over him, not a hair out of place, his white shirt still perfectly pressed. "The structural integrity of your defiance is crumbling, Leo," David said, his voice calm. "Stay down before you incur further damages." Leo didn't stay down. The pain was a spark in the dark, igniting a cold, hard resolve. He rolled to his feet, ignoring the ache in his ribs. He didn't go for the bag this time. He knew David would just block him again. Instead, he lunged toward the internal door that led to the home office. He knew Jennifer would be in there, probably already filing the paperwork to freeze his life. He burst into the office. The room was a sanctuary of glass and polished chrome. Jennifer sat behind a massive desk, her fingers dancing across a keyboard. She didn't look up as he entered, but she began to hum, a low, dissonant vibration that seemed to rattle Leo's teeth. It was the Jennifer dirge, the sound she made when she was presiding over a funeral or a foreclosure. "I need my papers," Leo said, his voice shaking. Jennifer looked up, her eyes like two chips of ice. "Your papers, Leo? You mean the documents the Miller family paid the state to produce? Your birth certificate, your social security card. Those are records of an investment. They stay in the safe." She gestured toward the open drawer of her desk, where a leather-bound folder sat. Leo didn't wait for her to finish. He dived across the desk, his fingers scrambling over the smooth mahogany. Jennifer shrieked, a sharp, bird-like sound that cut through her humming. Leo's hand closed around the folder. He felt the textured leather, the weight of his entire legal identity. "Leo, stop this instant!" David's voice boomed from the doorway. Leo didn't stop. He scrambled back, clutching the folder to his chest like a shield. He didn't look back. He bolted for the French doors that led to the patio. He burst through them, the humid New Jersey night air hitting him like a wet towel. He ran across the manicured lawn, the grass slick with evening dew. Behind him, he heard the heavy thud of the garage door opening and the distant, electronic chirp of a car alarm being deactivated. He didn't have his bag. He didn't have his laptop. He had the clothes on his back, the folder in his hand, and the brass plumb bob in his pocket. He reached the edge of the property, vaulting over the low stone wall and stumbling onto the asphalt of the suburban street. His heart was a jackhammer against his ribs. He checked his watch. It was 10:15 p.m. He reached the designated meeting spot, a dark corner under a flickering streetlight 3 blocks away. A silver sedan sat idling, its exhaust a white plume in the cool air. "Tyler," Leo gasped, reaching the passenger side window. "Go, man. Just go. They're right behind me." Tyler Johnson sat behind the wheel, his broad shoulders hunched, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He didn't unlock the door. He didn't even look at Leo. He stared straight ahead at the flickering light, his lips moving silently. "Sorry, steering wheel," Tyler whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Tyler, unlock the door." Leo pounded on the glass. Tyler finally turned his head. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He held up his phone. On the screen was a PDF document with a legal header. Miller and Associates versus Johnson. "They called my dad Leo," Tyler said, his voice cracking. "10 minutes ago. Your father, he found a discrepancy in my parents' mortgage from 10 years ago. A technicality in the deed. He said if I help you, he files the paperwork to void the title. My parents would lose the house by Monday." Leo froze. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the world. He looked at his best friend, the person who had promised him a way out, and saw a man who had been dismantled by a single phone call. "Tyler, please," Leo whispered. "I can't, Leo. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Tyler's foot hit the gas. The tires screeched on the pavement, the smell of burning rubber stinging Leo's nose. The silver sedan roared away, leaving Leo standing alone in the middle of the street, the yellow light of the lamp blinking above him like a dying eye. He was stranded. He was hunted. And for the first time in his life, Leo Miller realized that in his father's world, there were no friends. Only assets that hadn't been leveraged yet. The night air grew colder as Leo walked. He avoided the main roads, sticking to the shadows of the industrial district, where the towering silhouettes of warehouses loomed like sleeping giants. Every passing car made him flinch, the sweep of headlights against the brick walls feeling like a searchlight. He eventually found himself at the Rest Easy Motel, a crumbling 2-story structure that smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial-grade bleach. The neon sign buzzed with a high-pitched electrical whine that made his head ache. He paid for a week in cash, money he'd been hiding in his sock for months, and collapsed onto a bed that felt like it was stuffed with gravel. He didn't sleep. He spent the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic clink, 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 clink of his plumb bob. By dawn, he was at the warehouse. It was a massive, oppressive space, where the air was a thick fog of dust and exhaust. The temperature was a biting 45 degrees, a damp cold that seeped into his bone marrow. He spent 12 hours moving heavy crates, his muscles screaming, his fingers so stiff they felt like frozen sausages. When the warehouse shift ended, he ran 3 blocks to a Burger King, slipping into a greasy polyester uniform that smelled of old fry oil. He worked the broiler, the heat from the flames searing his face, while his back remained chilled by the draft from the drive-through window. At the end of his double shift, he sat in the break room, his head in his hands. He pulled his first paycheck from his pocket, the result of 80 hours of back-breaking labor. He tore the envelope open, expecting to see enough to cover next week's motel rent and maybe a decent meal. His heart sank. The net pay line was a fraction of what it should have been. Next to it was a cold, clinical notation. Garnishment, case number 4421-B. David had done it. He hadn't waited for a trial. He had filed a prejudgment wage attachment, claiming Leo was a flight risk. The state had taken 70% of his earnings before he even touched the paper. Leo stared at the check, the smell of grease and sweat suddenly overwhelming. He was working himself to death just to pay the interest on the debt of his own childhood. Desperation drove him to the bank the next morning. He stood in a sterile, white-tiled lobby in downtown Philadelphia, the fluorescent lights humming a sharp, agonizing note. He waited 40 minutes to see a manager, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who wore a suit that looked like it was made of armor. "I need an emergency personal loan," Leo said, leaning across her mahogany desk. "Just $5,000. I have a steady job, 2 jobs. I can pay it back." Mrs. Gable didn't even look at his pay stubs. She tapped a few keys on her computer, the rhythmic clicking sounding like a firing squad. She frowned, her thin lips disappearing into a line of disapproval. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with professional pity, "your credit report is unusual. There are dozens of notice of default filings from the last 48 hours. It appears you have outstanding liabilities with Miller and Associates totaling over $2 million. That's not real," Leo protested. "Those are fake charges my father made up." "The credit bureau doesn't care about family drama, Mr. Miller. They care about filings. Your score has dropped 300 points since yesterday morning. You are, effectively, a ghost in the financial system. No bank in this country will touch you." Leo walked out of the bank, the sunlight blindingly bright against the sidewalk. He felt small, diminished, as if the very buildings he loved were leaning in to crush him. He returned to the motel, his feet leaden. He reached his door, room 212, and fumbled with the plastic keycard. The lock clicked, and he stepped into the dim, recycled air of the room. He froze. The room was exactly as he'd left it, except for one thing. Resting on his pillow, perfectly centered, was a crisp white envelope. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He approached the bed, his hand trembling. He opened the envelope. Inside was a late notice for his first installment, printed on the same cream-colored bond paper David used. At the bottom, in elegant, looped handwriting that could only belong to Jennifer, was a note. "The lavender in the hallway here is such a poor substitute for the real thing, don't you think? See you soon." They had been in his room. They had bypassed the lock, stood over his bed, and left a calling card. The motel was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage with transparent walls. He realized then that Jennifer hadn't just hired a private investigator. She had hired a ghost, someone who could move through his life without leaving a footprint. He couldn't stay. He grabbed his duffel bag and bolted, not even bothering to check out. He spent the next 3 hours riding the subway, switching lines at random, watching the reflection in the dark glass to see if anyone followed. He ended up in the industrial district again, near the shipping docks. He ducked into a narrow alleyway behind a row of towering warehouses, the air smelling of salt water and rotting wood. He needed a moment to think, to breathe. "Leo Miller?" The voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Leo spun around. A man in a gray windbreaker stood at the mouth of the alley. He was nondescript, the kind of person you'd forget the moment he turned away. He held a thick blue folder. "I don't want it," Leo said, backing away. "You don't have to want it," the man said. He started walking forward, counting his steps under his breath. 1, 2, 3. Leo didn't wait for 4. He turned and sprinted deeper into the alley. He burst out into a maze of shipping containers, towering stacks of rusted steel that blocked out the sun. The wind whipped through the narrow corridors, making the metal groan and shriek like a living thing. He could hear the man behind him, the steady, rhythmic counting echoing off the corrugated walls. 10, 11, 12. Leo scrambled over a wooden pallet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He found himself in a dead end, 3 containers forming a rusted U-shape around him. He turned, his back against the cold metal. The man in the gray windbreaker rounded the corner. "You're served, Leo," the man said, reaching out with a blue folder. "No," Leo growled. He reached down and grabbed a heavy steel crate hook that had been left on the ground. The cold iron felt solid, a weapon of the working world against the paper-thin lies of his father. He swung it in a wide arc, the metal whistling through the air. The process server stepped back, his face remaining perfectly calm. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. "That's an assault charge, Leo. Do you really want to add that to the bill?" Leo didn't answer. He lunged to the left, sliding through a gap between 2 containers that was barely wide enough for his shoulders. He felt the rusted metal tear at his jacket, the smell of old iron filling his lungs. He didn't look back. He ran until his legs gave out, ending up in a public library 3 miles away. He sat at a computer terminal, his hands shaking so hard he could barely type. He accessed the public records database, searching for the names he'd seen on the documents in Jennifer's office. He found them. Apex Structural Holdings, LLC. He opened the filing. His heart stopped. There, at the bottom of the page, was his signature. It was a perfect replica, every loop and slant captured with terrifying precision. He had been listed as a primary co-signer on a series of construction loans for a project that didn't exist. The numbers were staggering. $20 million in loans, all diverted to offshore accounts, all currently in default. David hadn't just billed him for his childhood. He had used Leo's legal identity as a sacrificial lamb for a massive tax fraud scheme. If the company went under, and it was clearly designed to, Leo wouldn't just be in debt. He would be a felon. His phone buzzed on the desk. An unknown number. He answered it, his voice a whisper. "Hello? Did you find the filings, Leo?" Jennifer's voice was like silk over a razor blade. She was humming that dissonant tune again, the sound vibrating through the cheap plastic of the phone. "David is so disappointed. He wanted to keep it in the family, but you've made it so difficult. Now, when the IRS comes knocking, they won't be looking at the man in the white shirt. They'll be looking at the boy who ran away with the books." "You forged my name," Leo hissed. "We secured the legacy, Leo. And since you've decided to be an independent man, I suppose you're ready to handle the independent consequences. By the way, the bank just called. They're starting the foreclosure on that little coastal property your grandfather left you. Apparently, the co-signer, that's you, is in breach of the moral turpitude clause in the deed. It's all very legal. It's all very final." The line went dead. Leo sat in the silence of the library, the smell of old paper and floor wax suddenly feeling like a tomb. He was 23 years old, and his father had managed to bury him alive in a mountain of paper. The following days were a blur of gray skies and the persistent, metallic taste of fear. Leo moved through the city like a ghost, sleeping in 24-hour laundromats or on the hard plastic chairs of the Greyhound station. He felt the weight of the Miller name like a physical shackle, a brand that warned the world he was damaged goods. He met Sarah in a small park near the university. The air was crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and the distant scent of wood smoke. Sarah Williams, the woman who had been his anchor for 3 years, stood by a rusted swing set, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wouldn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the entrance to the park, her body angled toward the exit. "I can't do it, Leo," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I can't live like this." "It's almost over, Sarah," Leo pleaded, reaching for her hand. He felt the rhythmic clink, 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 clink of the plumb bob in his pocket, a desperate attempt to find center. "I'm finding the errors. I'm going to prove they forged the signatures." Sarah stepped back, her hair whipping across her face. "They followed me, Leo. A man in a gray windbreaker. He sat in the booth behind me at the diner. He didn't say anything. He just sat there and counted the sugar packets out loud. He knew my schedule. He knew my mother's maiden name. He told me that if I stay with you, I'm assuming the liability. He's just trying to scare you," Leo said, though his own heart was sinking. "It worked," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking. "I'm 22, Leo. I'm supposed to be worrying about my finals, not whether a process server is going to jump out of my closet. Your father, he sent a letter to my parents' shop, a notice of intent to investigate. They're terrified. I can't be the reason they lose everything." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small cardboard box. She set it on the bench between them. It contained his extra hoodie, a few architecture textbooks, and a framed photo of them at the beach. "Don't call me," she whispered. "Please, just let me go." She turned and walked away, her pace quick and frantic. She didn't look back, not even when she reached the gate. Leo sat on the bench, the cold wood biting into his legs. He felt a hollow space opening up in his chest, a structural failure that no amount of drafting could fix. He was alone. Truly, completely alone. He spent the next morning at the university registrar's office. He had $3,000, the last of his savings, and a few under-the-table shifts Michael Davis had given him at the warehouse. It was enough for the tuition deposit. If he could just stay in school, he could get a student loan, find a way to fight back from within the system. The clerk, a thin man in a crooked bow tie named Richard Scott, took Leo's debit card with a polite, practiced smile. "As my father used to say, education is the only asset they can't repossess, right?" He swiped the card. A sharp, aggressive beep echoed through the small office. Richard frowned. He tried it again. Beep. "That's strange," Richard muttered. "It's being declined. Refer to maker. That usually means the account is restricted." "Try it again," Leo said, his voice rising. "There's money in there. I checked it this morning." Richard tapped a few keys, his right habit disappearing as he read the screen. "Mr. Miller, it looks like there's an emergency court injunction on this account. It's been frozen by a firm called Miller and Associates. They've filed a protective order of assets pending the outcome of a civil suit. I'm afraid I can't take this payment." "But the deadline is tomorrow," Leo shouted, slamming his hand on the counter. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet office. "If I don't pay by tomorrow, I lose my spot. As my father used to say, the bursar waits for no man, right?" Richard said, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. There's nothing I can do. The system won't let me bypass the hold." Leo stumbled out of the office, his vision blurring. He went to a nearby diner, a greasy spoon joint where the air smelled of burnt coffee and old bacon. He sat in a back booth, his laptop open on the sticky table. He accessed his bank history one last time, searching for something, anything he had missed. His eyes caught a recurring number, a transfer of $50,000 every month for the last 3 years. It didn't go to the firm. It went to a private account labeled JM Holdings. He dug deeper, his fingers flying across the keys. He followed the digital trail through a series of shell companies, his architectural mind mapping the flow of money like the plumbing of a skyscraper. It wasn't David's money. It was Jennifer's. She wasn't just helping David secure the legacy. She was siphoning it off. She was building a private vault, an exit strategy that would leave both David and Leo in the rubble of the Miller firm's bankruptcy. She was embezzling from the very man who thought she was his most loyal soldier. A spark of hope flared in Leo's chest. This was it. This was the leverage. If he showed David the truth, David would have to stop the lawsuits. He would have to see that Leo wasn't the enemy. Jennifer was. He tracked David to the Gilded Cage, a high-end restaurant where the elite of the city went to be seen. The air inside was thick with the smell of expensive truffle oil and the aggressive clinking of silver against bone china. Leo pushed past the maitre d', his clothes rumpled, his face bruised and pale. He found David at a corner table, presiding over a dinner with 3 men in identical charcoal suits. David looked up, his expression shifting from professional boredom to icy irritation. "Leo," David said, his voice a low warning. "You are interrupting a closing. We need to talk," Leo said, leaning over the table. He ignored the judgmental stares of the other diners. He pulled a sheaf of printed bank statements from his jacket and slapped them onto the white tablecloth. "Look at the transfers, Dad. Look at the account numbers for JM Holdings. Jennifer isn't protecting your money. She's stealing it. She's been laundering it for years." David didn't look at the papers. He didn't even blink. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, the ice clinking against the glass with a sound like breaking teeth. "Jennifer told me you might try this," David said, his voice devoid of warmth. "She said you were becoming desperate, that you would try to sow discord to save yourself." "It's not a lie. Look at the dates. Look at the signatures." "I have looked at everything, Leo," David interrupted, his voice rising just enough to silence the table. "Jennifer is the one who found the discrepancies in your childhood accounts. She is the one who has been working 18-hour days to keep the firm afloat while you've been playing at being a martyr. You come in here, smelling of grease and failure, and you expect me to believe you over my wife. She's setting you up for the tax fraud," Leo shouted. "She's using my name to protect hers, but she's going to leave you holding the bag." David stood up. He was a head taller than Leo, his presence filling the space like a looming wall. "You are a disappointment, Leo. Not because you failed to join the firm, but because you lack the dignity to lose with grace. You've become a common slanderer." He gestured to 2 large men standing near the bar, his private security team. "Remove him and ensure he doesn't return." "Dad, no. Just look at the papers." The guards moved in with practiced, brutal efficiency. One grabbed Leo's arms, pinning them behind his back, while the other punched him squarely in the stomach. The air left Leo's lungs in a sickening whoosh. He was dragged toward the entrance, his heels scuffing the expensive carpet. The struggle moved toward the front of the restaurant, near the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked out onto the street. Leo fought back, kicking and twisting, his desperation giving him a burst of frantic strength. He managed to break one arm free and swung, his fist connecting with a guard's jaw. The guard didn't flinch. He grabbed Leo by the throat and shoved him backward with all his weight. The world turned into a cacophony of shattering glass. Leo felt the impact against his back, the sudden, sharp cold as the window gave way. He flew through the air, surrounded by a cloud of glittering shards that looked like diamonds in the streetlights. He hit the sidewalk hard, the breath knocked out of him again. He lay there, blood trickling from a dozen small cuts, the smell of exhaust and wet asphalt filling his nose. Inside the restaurant, David Miller didn't even turn around. He simply adjusted his tie and returned to his dinner, the Jennifer dirge humming softly from the woman sitting beside him. The rain began to fall as Leo lay on the cold concrete. It wasn't a cleansing rain. It was a heavy, soot-stained drizzle that made the city feel like it was weeping grease. He managed to crawl to his feet, his body a map of pain. He felt for the brass plumb bob in his pocket. It was still there. He had one last place to go. One last piece of his life that hadn't been touched by the Miller rot. He spent his last few dollars on a bus ticket to the county records office. He stood at the counter, his head bandaged with a piece of his own shirt, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "I need to check the title for the Oak Haven property," Leo said. The coastal land left to Leo Miller by Arthur Miller. The clerk, a woman who looked like she had been carved from the same gray stone as the building, pulled up the file. She scrolled through the digital history, the flickering monitor casting a sickly green light over her face. "That property was sold 3 days ago, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice monotone. "Sold? By whom?" "I'm the only owner. It was sold under a durable power of attorney," she said, turning the screen toward him. "Signed by you, notarized by a Jennifer Miller. The proceeds were used to satisfy an outstanding debt to Miller and Associates." Leo stared at the screen. The signature was there again. The perfect forgery. His grandfather's land, the place where he had spent his summers, the only place he had ever felt truly level, was gone. Sold to pay for the very debt that was being used to destroy him. He walked out into the rain, the sound of the city a chaotic, mocking roar. He had no money, no home, no family, no future. He reached the bus station and sat on a plastic chair, the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of a leaky pipe in the ceiling echoing the heartbeat of a dying man. He pulled the heavy folder of Miller legal documents from his bag. He had been carrying them like a burden, but now he began to read them with the eyes of an architect. He looked at the lines, the connections, the structural supports of the lies, and then he saw it. A small, insignificant detail. A date on the original statement of arrears and the co-signing documents for the shell company. The Millers had been so arrogant, so sure of their power, that they had overlooked a fundamental law of physics. They had listed the start of the debt and the signing of the corporate papers as occurring on his 18th birthday. But in the state of New Jersey, a contract signed on a birthday is legally considered to have been signed while the individual was still a minor until the exact hour of their birth. Leo had been born at 11:58 p.m. Every document they had used to trap him, every contract he had supposedly signed, had been executed during the hours of his minority. They weren't just forgeries. They were legally void. The realization was a cold, sharp light in the darkness of his mind. He pulled a law textbook from his duffel bag, the one he'd been studying in the library, and cross-referenced the jurisdictional statutes. It was there, a clear, undeniable error. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to a lawyer. He knew that in their world, paperwork could be corrected before it reached a judge. He needed to do this his way. He walked back to the Miller mansion. He didn't hide. He walked right up the driveway, the rain slicking his hair, his eyes fixed on the glowing windows of the home office. He could see them through the glass. David and Jennifer, sitting together, toast to their victory. He didn't knock. He used the emergency key hidden under the child's high chair on the patio, a relic of a childhood they had tried to bill him for. He stepped into the foyer, the smell of lavender suddenly feeling weak and pathetic. He walked into the office. David looked up, his face reddening with rage. I told you what would happen if you returned, Leo. I'm calling the police. Go ahead, Leo said, his voice calm and level. He tossed the law textbook onto the desk. But before you do, check page 442, and then check the timestamp on the Apex structural filings. David frowned, but he reached for the book. Jennifer stopped humming. She looked at the book, then at Leo, her eyes narrowing. You were a minor, David, Leo said, his voice gaining strength. Every lien, every garnishment, every debt you filed is based on a contract that doesn't exist in the eyes of the law. You didn't just forge my name. You forged it on the wrong day. David's fingers trembled as he scanned the page. He looked at the corporate filings on his computer, his face paling as he realized the structural flaw in his own masterpiece. And while you're at it, Leo continued, looking directly at Jennifer, you might want to ask your wife about the $50,000 a month she's been moving into JM Holdings. She wasn't just helping you sue me, Dad. She was using the lawsuits as a distraction to drain the firm dry before the IRS came for you. She's already got her ticket out. You're the one who's going to prison for the Apex fraud. The silence that followed was absolute. David turned to Jennifer, his eyes searching her face for a denial that didn't come. She didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed, like a master chess player who had been tripped by a child. Is it true? David whispered. Jennifer didn't answer. She simply stood up, smoothed her skirt, and began to hum that dissonant dirge one last time. She walked out of the room, her heels clicking on the hardwood, leaving David sitting in the ruins of his uniform life. Leo didn't stay to watch the fallout. He walked out onto the patio, the rain finally stopping. He found the leather-bound ledger of the Statement of Arrears sitting on a side table. He took a lighter from his pocket, the one he'd used to light his stove at the motel, and flicked it. The flame was small, but it caught the edge of the cream-colored paper. He dropped the ledger into the stone fireplace on the patio. He watched as the itemized list of his childhood turned to black ash, the smoke rising into the night air. The debt was gone, not because it was paid, but because it had never truly existed. He walked to the garage and found his old car, the one David had reported stolen. The keys were in the ignition. He drove out of the driveway, not looking back at the mansion or the broken man inside. He drove toward the university. He had no money, but he had his identity. He had his future. He would apply for aid as an independent student. He would sleep on Tyler's couch until he found a new job. He would build his own foundation, one brick at a time, and this time, he would be the one to ensure it was level. As the sun began to rise over the city, Leo Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass plumb bob. He held it up to the light, watching it hang perfectly still, perfectly straight. He didn't tap it. He didn't need the reminder anymore. He was his own primary architect. And for the first time in 23 years, the ground didn't shift beneath his feet.